When we think about the British Empire, it is often remembered as the largest empire in human history, an empire so vast that people once said, "The sun never sets on it." But to truly understand how Britain reached that point, we must start much earlier, before Britain even existed as a single nation. The story begins with England, the strongest power among the kingdoms of the British Isles. With its growing economy and a capable military, England gradually brought Wales and parts of Ireland under its influence, though Scotland remained fiercely independent until the 18th century. These early dynamics laid the foundation for England's expansionist mindset. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the English crown realized that wealth and power was shifting toward overseas exploration. European rivals like Spain and Portugal had already carved out huge colonial empires in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. England, although late to the game, was eager not to be left behind. Queen Elizabeth I commissioned explorers such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh to seek out new lands and opportunities. Their expeditions were bold, but often unstable. Most famously, the Roanoke colony in North America mysteriously vanished, leaving only speculation about the fate of its settlers. Still, these early failures planted the seeds of empire. At the same time, a new economic structure was emerging in England, the Joint Stock Company. Instead of relying only on royal funding, merchants and investors could pool money together to finance risky overseas ventures. The East India Company, established in 1600, was one of the most significant of these organizations. Granted monopolies over trade routes, it became not just a trading business, but eventually a political and military force overseas. Similarly, the Levant Company controlled trade with the Ottoman world. These private companies blurred the line between commerce and governance, shaping how Britain would operate its empire in the centuries to come. When James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne in 1603, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland, he inherited not only two kingdoms, but also their overseas ambitions. Colonization took several forms: crown colonies directly controlled by the monarchy, charter colonies with more political freedom, and proprietary colonies run by individuals or companies. This flexibility allowed England to experiment with different models of governance, though over time many reverted to direct crown control. One often overlooked but crucial step was the Ulster Plantation in Ireland, where English and Scottish settlers were moved into Northern Irish lands. This plantation model became a blueprint for later colonial settlements, particularly in North America and the Caribbean. It demonstrated how land could be seized, resettled, and economically exploited, a pattern that would be repeated across the world. Throughout the 1600s, England expanded aggressively in the Americas and the Caribbean, seizing territories not only through settlement, but also by conquering rival colonies. For example, New York was captured from the Dutch in 1665. Meanwhile, the Royal African Company, founded in 1660, took a leading role in the transatlantic slave trade, transporting enslaved Africans to work on plantations in the Americas. This brutal trade became a cornerstone of the empire's wealth and a dark legacy that still echoes today. In contrast, Scotland's attempts at colonization largely failed. The most notorious disaster was the Darien scheme in Panama in the 1690s, which bankrupted much of Scotland's elite and ultimately pushed the Scots toward union with England in 1707. This act of union created Great Britain, combining English and Scottish power into a single political entity that would dominate global affairs for centuries. Thus, by the dawn of the 18th century, Britain had transformed from a small island nation into an ambitious colonial power. Driven by trade, exploration, and competition with European rivals, it had laid the groundwork for an empire that would soon span the globe. The dawn of the 18th century marked a turning point for Britain's imperial ambitions. After the Act of Union in 1707, England and Scotland officially became Great Britain, combining their resources, military strength, and overseas aspirations. This political unification provided the stability and unity required for Britain to compete with European rivals such as France, Spain, and the Netherlands. From this point forward, Britain's empire grew not only through settlement, but also through war, diplomacy, and trade. One of the first major conflicts was the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701–1714. When Spain's monarchy faced a succession crisis, the balance of power in Europe was at stake. Britain, allied with several European powers, fought to prevent France and Spain from uniting under a single crown. The war stretched across Europe and into overseas territories. By its end, Britain had secured Gibraltar and Minorca in the Mediterranean and received Acadia and Newfoundland in North America. These acquisitions not only expanded Britain's territory, but also secured strategic naval bases, which reinforced Britain's growing naval supremacy. Meanwhile, the East India Company was becoming far more than a trading corporation. Originally established to exchange spices, textiles, and other goods, it developed private armies and began engaging in wars of its own. The most decisive moment came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, where Robert Clive led company forces to victory over the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies. This single battle effectively gave Britain control over Bengal, one of the richest regions of India. From there, the company expanded steadily, using both direct rule and alliances with local princes. Although not officially part of the empire at first, the East India Company operated as a state within a state, collecting taxes, administering justice, and exercising military power. In North America, Britain and France competed fiercely for dominance. The struggle came to a head during the 7 Years' War, 1756–1763, a global conflict that involved Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. Known in America as the French and Indian War, it saw Britain capture Quebec in 1759, which effectively ended France's colonial presence in mainland North America. By the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France ceded Canada and most of its territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain, while Spain handed over Florida. With this victory, Britain emerged as the preeminent colonial power in North America. However, these successes came with costs. Maintaining overseas colonies and waging constant wars drained Britain's treasury. To recover, Parliament imposed new taxes on its colonies, especially the 13 colonies in America. The Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and other measures angered colonists who argued that they were being taxed without representation. What began as discontent over taxation soon escalated into full-scale revolution. By 1776, the American colonies declared independence, and after a long war, Britain was forced to recognize the United States in 1783. This was the empire's first major loss, and it marked a dramatic shift in strategy. Though Britain had lost its most prosperous colonies, it did not retreat from empire. Instead, focus shifted toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, where opportunities for new trade and conquest remained. Explorers like Captain James Cook mapped Australia, New Zealand, and much of the Pacific, laying the groundwork for future settlement and expansion. Meanwhile, India was becoming the jewel of Britain's ambitions, a region whose resources and population promised enormous wealth. Thus, the 18th century was both a period of triumph and challenge. Britain had gained vast territories, secured naval dominance, and established itself as the leading imperial power. Yet, it had also suffered the humiliation of losing America. These contrasting experiences would shape the next phase of the empire, an era when Britain would turn increasingly toward Asia and the Pacific, laying the foundation for its so-called imperial century. By the dawn of the 19th century, Britain had emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as the world's leading naval and imperial power. The defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815 marked not just the end of French ambitions in Europe, but also the beginning of what historians often call Britain's imperial century. Between 1815 and 1914, Britain built the largest empire the world had ever seen, ruling vast territories across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific. A major factor behind this dominance was the Industrial Revolution. Britain became the first nation to industrialize, transforming itself into the workshop of the world. New machines, factories, and technologies allowed mass production of goods, while steamships and railways accelerated transport and trade. This industrial strength gave Britain both the wealth and the military capacity to expand its global reach. Colonies were not just political possessions. They were essential markets for British goods and sources of raw materials like cotton, coal, tea, and rubber. Another defining feature of this century was Britain's complex relationship with slavery. For over 200 years, Britain had profited enormously from the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were shipped to plantations in the Caribbean, producing sugar and other commodities that enriched Britain. But by the early 1800s, a powerful abolitionist movement grew within Britain. Campaigners like William Wilberforce mobilized public opinion, arguing that slavery was both immoral and incompatible with Britain's Christian values. In 1807, the British Parliament abolished the slave trade, and in 1834, slavery itself was formally abolished throughout the empire. This was a landmark achievement, though the economic reliance on colonial labor continued in new forms, such as indentured servitude from India and China. Meanwhile, Britain was consolidating its control in India. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, the British government dissolved the East India Company and placed India under direct Crown rule. This marked the beginning of the British Raj. India was considered the jewel in the crown of the empire, providing not only immense wealth through trade, but also strategic influence across Asia. The construction of railways, telegraphs, and irrigation systems was often portrayed as modernization, though in reality, these developments primarily served British interests. At the same time, Indian society and culture came under heavy strain as British rule reshaped local governance, economy, and traditions. In Africa, Britain became a central player during the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. After occupying the Cape Colony from the Dutch, Britain expanded into southern Africa, clashing with Boer settlers in a series of brutal wars. In North Africa, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 transformed global trade by linking the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. Britain quickly moved to secure control, occupying Egypt in 1882 to safeguard this vital route to India. Across the continent, British explorers, soldiers, and merchants pushed deeper inland, carving out colonies that would later become modern nations like Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, and South Africa. The empire also expanded in the Pacific. Australia and New Zealand, once penal colonies and frontier settlements, developed into prosperous dominions with increasing self-government by the late 19th century. Similarly, Canada, already granted self-rule in 1867, grew into a major dominion within the empire. These dominions demonstrated a new phase of empire, colonies that were white settler-based and gradually moved toward political independence while maintaining economic and cultural ties to Britain. At the height of the 19th century, Britain projected power not only through its colonies, but also through its role as the global policeman. The Royal Navy controlled key sea routes, while financial dominance from London banks shaped economies worldwide, even in countries not directly ruled by Britain. Telegraph lines, known as the All Red Line, connected Britain to its colonies, symbolizing the global communication and coordination of empire. Note: by 1900, the British Empire covered about 1/4 of the Earth's land and population. Its influence was unmatched, and its culture, language, and institutions were spreading across the globe. Yet beneath the surface, challenges were already emerging. Colonized peoples were beginning to demand self-determination, while rival powers like Germany and the United States were rising. Still, the 19th century remains the period when Britain stood unchallenged as the dominant imperial power. At the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood at its territorial peak. It ruled nearly 1/4 of the globe and governed hundreds of millions of people. Yet beneath this image of strength, the empire was already facing growing strains. Nationalist movements were rising in colonies. Rival powers like Germany and the United States were challenging Britain's dominance, and the cost of maintaining such a vast empire was becoming increasingly heavy. The first great shock came with the First World War, 1914-1918. Britain entered the conflict as part of the Allied powers, and the empire's global network became essential to the war effort. Over 2.5 million men from colonies and dominions fought, including soldiers from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa. These troops played a critical role in battles across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. While Britain emerged victorious, the war drained its economy, claimed the lives of nearly 1 million British soldiers, and left the empire deeply indebted to the United States. Territorially, Britain expanded after the war, acquiring former German and Ottoman possessions under the League of Nations mandate system. These included Palestine, Iraq, parts of Africa, and Pacific Islands. But these new territories came with challenges. In the Middle East, nationalist unrest grew rapidly, while in India, demands for independence intensified under leaders like Mahatma Gandhi. Britain's post-war promises of greater autonomy often fell short, creating disillusionment across the empire. The interwar years, 1919-1939, were marked by increasing instability. The Irish struggle for independence culminated in the creation of the Irish Free State in 1921, reducing Britain's control within its own isles. Meanwhile, economic depression in the 1930s weakened Britain's finances further, undermining its ability to maintain global dominance. At the same time, dominions like Canada, South Africa, and Australia moved toward greater independence, particularly after the 1931 Statute of Westminster, which recognized their right to self-governance in all domestic and foreign matters. The Second World War, 1939-1945, proved to be the decisive blow to Britain's imperial supremacy. Once again, Britain relied heavily on its empire for manpower and resources. Millions of colonial soldiers fought in North Africa, Europe, and Asia. The empire was crucial in sustaining Britain after the fall of France in 1940, providing food, supplies, and troops. Yet the war also exposed Britain's dependence on the United States, whose economic and military power now overshadowed Britain's own. By the end of the conflict, Britain was victorious but economically exhausted, heavily indebted, and incapable of maintaining its far-flung empire at the old scale. The war also unleashed a powerful wave of decolonization. In India, the Quit India movement and rising nationalist pressure made continued British rule unsustainable. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan, a moment seen as the beginning of the empire's collapse. Across Asia, colonies like Burma, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Malaya soon followed. In Africa, nationalist movements gained momentum, demanding independence and equality. Psychologically, too, the empire was shaken. The myth of invincibility had been broken. The fall of Singapore to Japan in 1942 shocked Britain and its colonies. It was proof that the empire could be defeated. Colonized peoples, who had sacrificed in 2 world wars, now demanded freedom as the price for their loyalty. By the late 1940s, Britain's global role was increasingly limited. It remained a major power, but it no longer had the resources or authority to rule over vast colonial territories. The process of imperial decline, which had begun with the American Revolution in the 18th century, now accelerated rapidly. The empire was giving way to a new world order, one dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union, and shaped by the struggles for independence across Asia and Africa. The aftermath of the Second World War left Britain victorious but exhausted, economically weakened, indebted to the United States, and overshadowed by 2 new superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. Britain could no longer sustain its vast global empire. What followed was a process of rapid decolonization that fundamentally reshaped the world map and transformed Britain's role in international affairs. The first major step was the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947. Once regarded as the jewel in the crown of the empire, India's independence symbolized the irreversible decline of British imperial rule. Within a few years, Burma, Myanmar, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Malaya also achieved independence. In the Middle East, mandates such as Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq moved beyond British control, often in turbulent and contested circumstances. The empire was unraveling at a pace unimaginable just decades earlier. In the 1950s and 1960s, Africa became the center of decolonization. Ghana led the way in 1957, followed by Nigeria, Kenya, Zambia, and dozens of other nations. Many of these transitions were peaceful, but others were marked by violent struggle, such as the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. Across the continent, nationalist leaders demanded sovereignty, arguing that colonial rule was no longer acceptable in the age of self-determination. By the 1970s, the vast majority of Britain's African colonies had become independent states. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, the Pacific, and smaller territories, independence came more gradually. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and others achieved sovereignty during the 1960s and 1970s. Yet some territories, such as Bermuda, the Falkland Islands, and Gibraltar, remained under British control, often by the choice of their populations. Even today, Britain retains 14 overseas territories, reminders of its imperial past. Perhaps the most symbolic end of empire came in 1997, when Britain handed over Hong Kong to China. Hong Kong had been one of the last great imperial possessions, a thriving financial hub acquired after the Opium Wars of the 19th century. Its transfer was seen worldwide as the final curtain on the British Empire. By then, nearly all of Britain's former colonies had achieved independence. Yet the empire did not simply vanish. It transformed into something new, the Commonwealth of Nations. Established gradually throughout the 20th century, the Commonwealth became a voluntary association of independent states, most of which were once part of the empire. It provided a platform for cooperation in trade, culture, and diplomacy. Many countries retained English as an official language, adopted British-style legal and parliamentary systems, and maintained close ties with Britain. Even today, 14 countries, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, continue to recognize the British monarch as their head of state. The legacy of the British Empire remains complex. On one hand, it spread the English language, legal traditions, and aspects of British culture around the globe. On the other, it left deep scars, economic inequality, political borders drawn without regard to local realities, and memories of exploitation and resistance. Modern Britain itself reflects this legacy, a multicultural society where people from former colonies live, work, and contribute to its culture. Although the empire is gone, its influence persists in global institutions, international trade, and cultural connections. The story of the British Empire is not only one of conquest and power, but also of transformation, adaptation, and enduring impact. What began as a small island's quest for survival grew into the largest empire in history. And though it has faded, its echoes continue to shape our modern world.